Over the past year, we've become all too familiar with these words. Unprecedented, disruption, the new normal. There's no question that COVID-19 is changing how we live and work, but it's also changing how we think about societies, about systems, about the spaces we inhabit, politics, economics, institutions, public health, local communities, the environment. The future is unwritten, the map is blank, and yet, we must move forward together. Cambridge Global Conversations will be talking to thought leaders across these fields and beyond, discussing our possible paths as we forge ahead into uncharted territory.
My name's Diane Coyle. I'm Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and co-director of the Bennett Institute. One of our main research programmes there is the Wealth Economy Project, where we look at, in effect, society's balance sheet. What are all the assets that we have that will enable us to grow sustainably in the future? Among many other areas of research, from digital technology and digital government to well-being and the importance of place in what determines people's lives. We think about a society's comprehensive wealth, sometimes called true wealth or inclusive wealth, and that refers to all of the things that people need to be able to access to get on and do what they want to do in life. If you say wealth to somebody, they probably automatically think about money and ostentatious displays of rich people. Money is part of the story, but it's by no means the whole story. So we're also thinking about the wealth that nature gives us, and that's called natural capital in economic jargon, thinking about social capital, or in other words, what are the resources that we have from our social connections, whether that's family or community or even larger scale than that, or workplaces and colleagues at work. We think about human capital, which is that the if you like, the assets that we have ourselves, our skills and our health, and intangible sorts of capital too, which are becoming more and more important in the economy, such as data and intellectual property, and these things that you couldn't measure in any physical way, but we know are increasingly important to the jobs that people do and the wealth that society creates. And the key thing about these is that if people don't have access to one or the other of them, they can make up for it to a degree, but actually they're all important and they all work together. They interact with each other. And that's what our research programme is about. We're trying to measure them and define them like good researchers, but understand how they interact and how they shape people's opportunities in life. If you think about natural capital, nature, what are the services that we get from nature to lead our lives? It's generally been left out of conventional economics too much, and particularly in the way we measure the economy. We measure it by GDP growth, and nature doesn't count as part of the economy in that way. But it's really important for delivering, if you like, hard economic outcomes. So, for example, think about biodiversity. Our colleague Sapatha Dasgupta is writing a major report on the loss of biodiversity, and this is going to affect, over the long term, the productivity of agriculture and our capacity to feed ourselves and support the food system. Or to give another example, people's human capital depends not only on educational qualifications, which is how economists often measure it, but also on their health. And we've learned during the pandemic that respiratory health, which is affected by pollution and how close you live to major roads, is a really important indicator for your vulnerability to the effects of the virus. And these are just two examples. There are countless examples of how these types of capital relate to each other. A lot of the concepts that we're dealing with seem a little bit fuzzy. They're very broad concepts, like a lot of ideas in the social sciences. And so people often say, well, shouldn't we just stick to the things that we can measure for sure? And I think that's because there's a misapprehension about the sureness of the things that we measure anyway. GDP is not a thing, it's an idea, in the way that social capital or natural capital is an idea. And just as economists and statisticians spent a decade or so after the Second World War figuring out exactly what they ought to be measuring for GDP and the standard national accounts, we should be doing the same thing now, working out an agreed definition and finding the data that we need to measure that, and that will be just as solid as GDP. The other aspect of it that people who are not economists often find troubling is that we put a monetary value on things that many people instinctively feel have a value beyond money, beyond price. Nature, for example, is intrinsically valuable. And of course that's true. But the point about putting a monetary value on these things is that you can then compare everything on the same spreadsheet, as it were. And that if you are talking to policymakers who are looking at where to make an investment, they can bring into consideration both the standard monetary measures of economic growth or whatever it might be, but also these equally important but not so easy to measure kinds of considerations. And if you don't do that, then that's like putting a zero and not taking them into account. The measurements are really important because they're the lens through which we see what's going on and that we use to make our decisions. If you think about these types of capital, these types of asset on a global scale, it's a bit of a mixed picture. Generally around the world, investment in education has been going up over the long term. And so that's an indicator that human capital is on the increase in many countries. On the other hand, there are lots of indicators of depletion of natural capital in many countries around the world. And so, for example, that's biodiversity, climate change, depletion of certain specific resources, water quality. A lot of these have been in decline, and in the case of climate, we're obviously getting to the point of crisis where we're very worried about the consequences if we don't tackle that soon. On social capital, it's, I think, a very mixed picture, but in many countries, we're seeing signs of declining trust and polarisation, declining trust in governments or in big businesses, existing kinds of institutions. And so that's a bit of a worrying sign. People's trust in their local community or their family might be as strong as ever, but the fact that there is, in some cases, a declining trust in these institutions that have shaped our society over many decades now suggests that there's been some decline in social capital too. But it's a complicated area, and it's where these interactions between different kinds of asset come together. I don't think there's any hard science about how you increase social capital. It's an outcome, in a way, of the interactions between people and businesses and public bodies and governments. And so there's no single lever that you could pull to increase it. But the way to think about it is to think about all the situations and contexts in which people come together and meet people who might disagree with them, and how do they negotiate those disagreements. And in the past, in the Victorian era, we saw the development of all kinds of new institutions that started to build that kind of social capital. So mutual societies, mutual insurance societies, for example, or the workers' educational groups, or public libraries and art galleries. And these are the kinds of partly physical buildings and facilities, but also institutional arrangements that are now starting to be called social infrastructure. So the question for governments and policymakers is then, do you need to invest in certain kinds of social infrastructure, the sorts of places where people might be able to meet and negotiate their disagreements and conflicts? When it comes to natural capital, the picture is quite complicated because lots of different entities have the ability to affect natural capital. So government certainly can play a role, and one example might be that when the government's thinking about building flood defences, it thinks about incorporating green capital as well as concrete. So you think about planting trees upland or preserving wetlands downstream. But another example would be, what do companies think about when they are building facilities or thinking about their supply chain, and what's the extent of their responsibility? Or in our own case, we need to be thinking about what's our carbon footprint when we buy a new washing machine or think about moving into a different kind of house, and do we need to get it insulated? And so there are lots of different ways in which all of us in all of our different roles can start thinking about rebuilding natural capital. I very often think about the Victorians and the length of the time horizon over which they thought when they created institutions and bits of our infrastructure. We're still living in houses that the Victorians built and using rail lines that they invested in. And so I would really like to see governments take that long-term perspective and think about building for the next 150 years, and not to worry for some time, at least after this conversation, about the financial situation of the government, because they're borrowing money for free at the moment. If they're investing in things that have any kind of positive return, that's good value. And I hope they will think about investing not just for the next election or the one after that, but for the next century. I don't think it's very easy to get people to change their time horizon in this way, and particularly in an era of social media when a lot of people only seem to care about the next few minutes at best. Funnily enough, businesses are among the more long-term people that I talk to now. Our Wealth Economy project has been funded by a business, Letter One. If you think about any businesses operating in water supply or energy, they're building infrastructure that they know has to have a life of decades. And so in a funny way, they're more long-termist than the politicians in current circumstances. And I think there's scope for some really quite visionary people in business to start changing the tone of this conversation. And to go back to my Victorian example, that actually was probably the case then too. One way you could think about the pandemic is that it's a consequence, an externality, if you like, of human activity through impinging on nature, through farms and other activities, getting too close to areas of wildlife, which means that what are called zoonotic diseases can jump to humans much more quickly. I do talk a lot about externalities as an economist, and the idea is that you're doing some kind of activity which has spillover effects on other people, that there are consequences for them that were not part of the activity that you originally planned. And it is a very useful concept. But I've increasingly come to think that actually we tend to dismiss externalities as something outside the thing that we're really interested in analysing as economists. But in a way, the world is all externalities. We live in society, so almost everything that we do impinges in some way on other people. And I'm not sure how useful I think it is as a framework. One of the features of almost all economies in the past couple of decades has been that richer places and richer people have pulled further and further ahead of poorer places and poorer people. And we've got vicious and virtuous circles. People who live in a place that's not got good jobs or good amenities or isn't well connected to anything will also be the kind of place that's got poor housing, that might have little access to green space, where the quality of the schools and healthcare isn't so good. And also because they're low-income places, they don't have private sector amenities either. So the big supermarkets will go elsewhere, or the big leisure centres. And so you get these mutually reinforcing sources of disadvantage, and also for the better places advantage, and things get worse and worse, the divergences get worse and worse. So if you're thinking about policies to address that, we're talking about some really quite big changes in how we've been thinking about things, including government investment in infrastructure. If you're going to do a new railway line, conventionally you would think about where do you get the highest return, and that's going to be in places where people will commute into a major city and productivity is already high. That probably needs to change, and you would think about making investments in the context of what's the government's wider strategy towards levelling up. And in that case, you tilt the calculation towards places that are not so well served, even if the return isn't so high. And I think actually there should be a minimum offer of both concrete and metal infrastructure and broadband infrastructure, and also what's called social infrastructure, including healthcare and education. Every place in the country, everybody in the country should be able to access a minimum level of all of those things that you need to take part meaningfully in economic life. I don't think there's an easy answer to what level of government or what spatial level should you be making these decisions at, except to say that in the United Kingdom we're very clearly too centralised, and Whitehall and Westminster just do not have the information that they would need to make good decisions about every part of the country. We've been on a journey of devolution, both the nations and the English regions and English cities, and I think that needs to continue and go further. And more responsibilities, but also more resources and tools need to be given to levels of government below the central government in London. Where you stop and what the right tools are, I'm not sure we've entirely worked that out yet. And it's something that's definitely going to be changing, I think, given the political situation over the next 5 or 10 years. One of the things that I think we should take from the experience after the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 is that there was no growth in incomes, no improvement in living standards for many people around the country for a long period afterwards. And at the same time, on TV and social media, it was apparent that the very rich were doing better than ever, partly a consequence of all kinds of central banks doing what's called quantitative easing and pushing asset prices up. So anybody who had stock market wealth was going to get ever richer. That had the great benefit of stopping us going into recession and stopping unemployment going up, but it did exacerbate those visible inequalities. And that had a geography too, and I think we were very slow in many countries, not just the UK, to notice that geography. And so that must have fed in some way into the Brexit vote and into the kind of polarisation that you see between regions in other rich countries as well. So I think there were things that we missed. And also that there was too much austerity, that there was too swift a focus by governments on getting the public finances back into order. And we see that in consequences like the fact that health services, not just here in the UK again, but in many countries, are finding it really hard to cope. And of course, they're facing extraordinary demands at the moment. But I think it's a clear indication that we ran essential public services too hot for efficiency when we should have been thinking about resilience and what were the potential challenges that they might face at some point in the future. And this was a challenge, the pandemic was a challenge that was on the government's highest risk list, so it wasn't that nobody saw it coming. I've been working on the digital economy for many years now, since the late 1990s, and obviously data has become a focus lately because it has been generated by the way we use the digital technologies, and it's most used by the big tech companies. And I don't think the conversation we have about it is very helpful. The amount of data that's being used has been rocketing, but it's almost all being used by large companies with the capability to make use of it. And it's been framed very much in terms of personal data and what's the personal transaction between me and the company. By default, the companies that are collecting it and using it are deemed to be the owners of the data, so there's a legal presumption there that just sort of happened without anybody thinking about it. But I think the focus on what can it do for me is a bit misleading, because the value in data, my data, lies in it being combined with other people's data. So there's a difference between privacy and personal. There are things that I really want to be kept private, but they're valuable when they're combined with other individuals' data. And I think we ought to be having a conversation much more about what are those societal benefits that we can get from personal data, and also from all of the Internet of Things data that will be coming along in a big way before too long. And we need to have the legal framework, the regulatory framework in place that makes it possible for new companies to get into the market and use data and provide new services that will benefit us, but also to ensure that we as individuals who are providing the data get that benefit down the road. So I would think about what are we going to get out of it in terms of making our lives better, rather than should I make Facebook pay me now for little bits of data that it uses. My hopes and fears are probably the same, or two sides of the same coin, and it's that we have reached a stage of such economic crisis, societal questioning, political confrontation, that there could be a future conflict ahead and we'd find it very hard to resolve these issues, or it could be an opportunity. And so I'm trying in all the ways open to me to make sure that it's an opportunity that we don't miss and that we take advantage of a really wide sense that things have to change in a systematic way.